The points I made in the previous session were that complementary foods must complete, and the word is complete, they must complete breast milk. So they must provide what foods are not available, what nutrients are not available in breast milk. And we distinguish that from breast milk substitutes. And my argument will be that the dietary guidelines, which we're going to go through, acknowledge that. They acknowledge that meat and dairy products and cheese are crucial because they are real complementary foods, because they contain the nutrients, especially zinc and iron, that is in low concentration in the breast milk substitutes. So what I'd like to do is to show that the dietary guidelines for weaning are precisely what I said. They are precisely what I said. So this article is discovered on page 519, but let's move on to the next. And this is the first conclusion. And this shows the concern of the authors. Although cereals, fruit and vegetables, now cereals, notice they mention cereals. Cereals, fruit and vegetables being good sources of energy and some, my emphasis, nutrients, especially if enriched, were correctly perceived as suitable first food for infants of 6 to 12 months, it is cause for concern that real complementary foods, the true complementary foods, such as chicken, meat and egg yolk, rich in protein, iron and zinc. So that's the point. Those are complementary foods. They are real complementary foods because they complement and complete breast milk. Were seldom mentioned and could therefore be emphasized in the supportive documentation. What they're saying is that when they spoke to mothers, they interviewed mothers to find what did they think about what was proper complementary feeding, too frequently the mothers were unaware that in South Africa that these were the foods that should be mentioned. And guideline 6, and these are the food-based dietary guidelines for South Africa as drawn up by these experts, Leslie Bourne, Debbie Meyer and Penny Love. Guideline 6, children can eat chicken, fish, meat, eggs, beans, soy, or peanut butter every day. So those are the guidelines. So we've got the warning that we mustn't think that complementary foods are cereals, fruit and vegetables because they don't complete the breast milk. Chicken, meat and egg yolk, rich in protein, iron and zinc, and that's what the child should be looking for. So now we come to a document, the complementary feeding, a critical window of opportunity from 6 months onwards, and that is what this case is all about. It's weaning after 6 months, between 6 months and 12 months, presumably. And this paper is written by Professor Dr. Duplessis, Senior Lecturer, Division of Human Nutrition, Faculty of Medicine and Health Science at Stellenbosch University, and by Professor Kruger, who is with us today from Potchefstroom, the Northwest University, Potchefstroom. So this is what we are taught are the guidelines for complementary feeding. And I will argue that they do not differentiate in one word from what I've suggested. So the authors notice the following, and it's critically important for the whole debate. Soft maize meal porridge, a bulky food of low nutrient density, i.e. that is not a complete food, it's not what you wean children onto, is the food most often used by South African mothers to introduce solids to their infants. So here we have a problem that the majority of South African mothers are introducing a non-complementary food. They're weaning their children onto a non-complementary food by definition. Maize meal is typically diluted with water to obtain a thin consistency which lowers the nutrient density even further and is higher in phytates which inhibit iron and zinc absorption. Point I made. If you want to absorb iron and zinc, you get it in the packaging that it's designed to be in, which is meat. Not in cereals, because cereals contain phytates which inhibit the absorption. So they then found that less than 20% of the infants consumed animal products or vitamin A-rich foods and fruit and vegetable. Only 20% consumed dairy produce in a 24-hour recall period. Although protein and energy intake was adequate, the nutrient composition of this typical rural South African complementary diet was found to be insufficient. And what's it insufficient with? It's insufficient with iron, zinc, and calcium. Infants who consumed commercial infant products, i.e. enriched infant cereals, ready-to-eat bottled baby fluids, etc., had higher intakes of micronutrients than infants who did not. Now notice they said they have higher intakes, but we don't know if they're absorbed. And if you're eating those with phytates present in cereals, it's very likely they're not going to be absorbed. So one cannot assume that simply because the micronutrient is present in what you're eating, that it's going to be absorbed. And they continue, the nutrient density of complementary foods must be very high. Complementary diets in developing countries often do not contain adequate amounts of key nutrients such as zinc and iron because of lack of diversity in the diet and dependence on plant-based staples such as maize. What's missing? Meat and dairy products and eggs. That's what's missing. The recommended foods for complementary feeding should address the key nutrient gaps that are most prevalent in a particular setting. And that they should have added is the absence of meat, chicken, dairy, eggs. That's what they're actually saying in that statement. And now they start to say, well, what are suitable complementary foods? And that's what this debate is all about. So the PAHO and the WHO provide the following guidelines with regard to complementary foods that can provide adequate nutrients to meet the growing breastfed child's nutritional needs. Variety of foods, okay? Then what is it? Meat, poultry, fish, and eggs should be eaten not once a month, not once a week, daily, or as often as possible. So in fact, once a day is not enough. If you could eat it 5 times a day, that's what that guideline says. You should eat it 5 times a day. At this stage, vegetarian diets cannot meet nutrient needs unless nutrient supplements or fortified products are used. And then vitamin A-rich vegetables, and then what? Provide diets with an adequate fat content. So they're saying wean your child onto a high-fat diet, which is what I said. And then you must use complementary foods. So they continue the eating of foods from animal sources is associated with improved nutrient intake and diet quality, which results in better growth outcomes. So they're acknowledging that if you eat meat, eggs, dairy, you have a better outcome. You grow taller. So, and we'll show that the evidence is clear, and they're quoting good science. Thus, it's recommended that meat, poultry, fish, and eggs should be eaten daily or as often as possible. Unfortunately, these foods are often expensive, and so their inclusion in the diet in the required amounts may be a challenge, especially for lower income groups. And that, of course, is the challenge we face, but we don't think it's insoluble. So, examples of relatively inexpensive food from animal sources containing adequate amounts of protein, iron, zinc, and vitamin A include chicken, beef, or sheep liver and eggs. Sheep liver. And I've been criticized for saying that children should be raised to some extent on liver. There it's in the dietary guidelines say it. The regular intake of liver was associated with a favorable vitamin A status in children in Northern Cape Province, and that is the work of Dr. Danzi, who's an expert with us today. So it suggests, that suggestion would be that intake of liver was in fact healthy for the children. And they continue, animal food products are high in many micronutrients, and many minerals and vitamins are better absorbed from milk, meat, and eggs than from plant-derived foods. And again, the point is because foods are designed not to be eaten. Humans don't understand that. The reason why we can eat meat easily because animals run away from us and we can digest their food easily once we catch them. It's difficult catching them. But plants evolved not to be eaten, and they have all these anti-nutrients which are designed to make sure we have struggled to digest them. And we never told that. And that's why we have to refine food, refine cereals and grains to such an extent, because we have to get rid of all these anti-nutrients. So that's the point, better absorbed from animal sources than from plant-derived foods, because plants have evolved not to be eaten. Most foods from animal sources is more energy dense than plant-based foods because of the higher fat content and better source of fat-soluble vitamins and essential fatty acids. And when you take animal produce out of the diet, it becomes fat-soluble vitamin deficient. As I showed you, on this, a cereal-based diet is deficient in vitamins, particularly vitamin D. Animal foods are the only, my emphasis, foods that contain enough zinc, iron and calcium and riboflavin to supply daily requirements for complementary feeding while being low in anti-nutrients. And you see what's happened is cereals and grains have been health washed. As I said, carbohydrates were health washed, but when we replaced fat, we had to replace some cereals and grains. So we had to make out that cereals and grains were incredibly healthy for us. And we health washed them, and we didn't acknowledge all these complications, which we'll address later, of the anti-nutrients that are present in cereals and grains. And they acknowledge it there. Infants have a great need for iron because of rapid growth and depleted iron stores. Therefore, complementary foods should supply nearly all of the infant's iron requirements beyond the age of 6 months. So it must be an iron-rich food, and that iron-rich foods are animal products, and they allow the iron to be absorbed because they're not the anti-nutrients that exist in cereal and grains, which even if supplemented with iron and zinc, will not have the same absorption rates as in animal-based products. So then they start to look at the literature, and we'll also go over some of the literature. The addition of 25 grams of meat to a home-prepared vegetable meal for infants aged 7 to 8 months was shown to increase the absorption of non-heme iron. And that's again the point, that the iron is better absorbed if it comes in the proper packaging. And also prevented a decline in hemoglobin concentrations. Hemoglobin is why you take iron, to increase your blood hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. In a study by Krebs et al., exclusively breastfed infants were randomized to either pureed beef or iron-enriched infant cereals as the first complementary food. And they noticed that the mean daily zinc intake from the complementary foods for the infants in the meat group was 1.9 milligrams, compared to 0.6 milligrams in the cereal group, which is approximately 25% of the average daily requirement. And then they noticed that the increase in head circumference in infants aged 7 to 12 months was marginally greater in the meat group. Zinc and protein intake was a predictor of head growth. And we're going to come back to this. That first 1,000 days are so crucial, that the child must have the nutrients it needs to develop its brain. And we're going to discuss the evidence at the end of 12 months. If you measure the child's head circumference, you can predict to some extent its future intellectual growth. And that's frightening. If our intellectual growth is determined at 12 months, and it's determined by quality of the food that we gave the child, and particularly whether that child had enough zinc and iron and other brain-specific nutrients to develop the brain during this period of explosive brain growth. And cereals and grains don't provide those nutrients. And they noticed then that as breast milk is generally a more abundant source of fat than most complementary foods, total fat intake often decreases as the contribution of breast milk to total dietary energy declines. And this raises the question, why does breast milk have so much fat in it? Why does breast milk have so much fat in it? And the answer is because the baby needs that fat to develop its brain. And once you start cutting the fat, you can expect that the brain growth will not be as good as it should be. And so again, I make the point that the neonate is different from all other ages because the need for fat to grow the brain is so enormous. And that if we don't address that, we develop generations of children. We develop generations of children who may be brain compromised. So the general fat intake recommended to supply sufficient EFAs, and we'll come to those, while at the same time decreasing the likelihood of child obesity, is that fat should provide 30 to 45% of the total energy. Notice that's a minimum. They don't say that's the maximum, they say that's a minimum. And what is that? That is a high-fat diet. So what the guidelines say is that you must wean your child onto a high-fat diet, which is essentially what I was saying, or am saying. And the amount of fat to be provided by the complementary diet is dependent on the intake of breast milk. It's important to also consider the potential effects of added fat on the overall nutrient density of the diet in vulnerable populations. Fat is an important part of the diet in infants. There it is, written by the experts in South Africa. Fat is an important part of the diet in infants and young children because it provides these fats which are essential for brain development, the EFAs, and it facilitates the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins and enhances dietary energy, density, and sensory qualities. So surely they're saying fat is important in the diet. They're not saying it's not, you must avoid fat. They're saying you must find fat, it's essential. Omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, particularly docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, are known to play an important role in the growth and development of infants and young children. The associated intake in pregnancy and earlier life affects growth and cognitive performance later in childhood, again showing that fat intake with omega-3s and omega-6s is crucially important for the developing brain and for later cognitive performance. Again emphasizing what happens in those first 1,000 days is crucially important.